Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another Brilliantio show. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Susan Ramsey, who's instructed a course called Story Power. And it's all about growing resilient children. So we're going to dig into that very shortly. Susan, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, where are you joining us from? Where are you at the moment?
So home for me is a place called Napanee, which is a small town in Ontario in Canada. And I often describe it as a sort of halfway between the capital city of Canada, being Ottawa, and sort of one of our bigger cities in Canada, Toronto. And we're sort of partway, sort of halfway between those two larger centers. But really, home it's on a long road that it's called Little Creek Road. And as you can imagine, there's a creek nearby, and I'm surrounded by shagbark hickory woods, and it's not city at all.
That sounds wonderful. But how is the? I mean, just before we get on to the main topic, how has the whole COVID-19 thing impacted there? I mean, has it changed a lot of people's lives? Are people much more closeted now, or what's going on?
Oh, incredibly so. Yes. So we our big outing is to go outside for a walk on our road and sort of avoid the neighbors who are also out for a walk, and just sort of shout to them and say hello. But certainly the grocery stores are sort of, and are one of the few stores that are open, and pharmacies and schools are closed.
And what about for the kids? I mean, it must be quite tough for them, no?
So a lot of only emergency or sort of essential workers are allowed to be at work. So there's a lot of parents who are home with trying to work from home, as well as support their children's learning with the support of educators who may be trying to connect with them digitally.
Right. Yeah, actually, my son is in London. He's 15, and you know, he reports that basically they have a system called Cake or something like that, which I guess is some sort of euphemism for homework via the internet, right? That they've plugged in for, at least for his school. And you know, every time I try and catch him now for a game of chess, he says, "Oh no, I've got to go. I've got another cake session coming up." You know, and so there's a kind of new reality being cooked up right now for the kids. You know,
there absolutely is, yeah. And it's tough.
Sorry, it's tough.
It's really tough, especially for the youngest children, like for those who are in programs in childcare programs that sort of digital means are not the go-to for being with them. And
yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Which actually is a kind of perfect lead-in, really, or an imperfect lead-in, given the real circumstances, into the topic of your course. And just before we dive into the kind of the backstory to it, I mean, give us a snapshot of what the course is, and what the aim of the course is. You know, what's the goal?
Well, the course is called Story Power, and it is about the power of story in shaping children's lives and sort of how they see themselves, what they understand their self-identity to be, that comes to them through story. And it's not just about the stories that we might read to them or tell to them orally. Of course, that's part of it, but it's also about the stories that we convey to them in our everyday conversations, in our interactions. I think a lot of times parents and educators don't necessarily see themselves as storytellers. They think that that's something that's a gift that only certain people have.
Right.
That we tell stories all the time. We're constantly interacting with children, and even when we remember what silly thing the dog did earlier in the day, or we're imagining maybe something that the child is, maybe a picture or something the child was drawn and put in the mail to their grandmother, and sort of imagining what grandma's going to think about or feel or look like when she opens up this envelope. Those things, when you're imagining or retelling, they're part of storytelling too.
Right. Right. So it's actually because the title's interesting, right? It's growing resilience in children, yeah, or growing resilience with your children. I guess it would really be right. And I mean, my kind of memory of my father's attempts to grow resilience with me was actually quite literally being dangled off a cliff face somewhere off the English coast. And I recall I must have been about 5 or 6 years old, being held by the ankles over a cliff edge, right? And being absolutely, and I still remember the feeling even today. Right, and then I went on in life to do all sorts of kind of dramatic stuff in various countries, and I suppose in some ways it prepared me and made me more resilient. But how I mean, what actually is resilience? I mean, how do you what's your feeling of what resilience really is actually? Let's say when it comes to children.
So when I think of resilience, and I think of that with children, but I think of them as being able to see possibilities when things are tough. I see them as having the confidence to try something and have it fail and get up and try again. I see resilience as knowing that they're not alone, that they have a community, that they have others, that they can be connected to others to move forward. So resilience to me has to do with an awareness and a confidence to be able to try things.
Yeah. Do you think that part of the, I mean, this is probably part of your course, right? But do you think that part of the equation is actually, almost sort of building some resilience in adults first, so that they can then be resilient and demonstrate resilience for their children? Is that part of your approach? Is that something you would?
Yes. So truly, the course is intended to be. It has some ideas of sort of practical or playful things you can do with children, but a lot of it is based on a pause for educators, for parents, for anybody really who's got a young child in their life, to stop and think and reflect about the ways in which we model, we convey, we show our values, we show children that we believe in their intelligence and their strength.
Right.
It is a course that's for both internal reflection as well as practical application.
That sounds beautiful, yeah. And I recall when I was at school, because I went to a private school in England. I mean, the basic approach was to program our whole day. So, study began at 7:15 in the morning. Breakfast was at 8. The first classes were at 8:45. Then there was a run, perhaps in the middle of the morning, a very brief lunch, programmed classes after that, dinner, programmed evening activities, and that was basically the end of the day. And I think the kind of the intention, I suppose, was just to keep us busy all of the time. I mean, obviously to develop us and everything else, but basically it was a kind of program of action. And I know, speaking again with my son on FaceTimes and things, that Alex tells me that, it's clear that he's really busy. I mean, they've got a tremendous amount of stuff that actually is flying at them all the time, and actually quite energy sapping. Yeah, he's often quite tired. Yeah, and I wonder, how to start. I suppose how to start unburdening children from that welter of of work, that welter of stuff, and perhaps also the welter of information that they now get through social media or through the internet, right? Because I mean, I know, for example, just speaking personally, I know a lot of his experience is actually coming out of YouTube. It's kind of a YouTube education, right? Constantly browsing the channels. I know this may be ironic since we're actually on YouTube, but constantly browsing the channels and actually absorbing basically a kind of alternative education in parallel with the school curriculum. And so when I stop to think about the amount of information that is actually kind of downloading, all the time, it does trouble me a little. Yeah, how can we approach that?
There's been a huge shift in Canada, in Ontario, where I'm from, and really across many parts of the world as well. So especially with early learning, there's been a shift in thinking of, we have adult defined curriculum, and we're going to focus on that, and we're going to drill the concepts that adults have decided children need to learn into their thinking. They're going to do a lot of practicing. They're going to listen, they're going to practice, and then we're going to test them. So there's been a shift from that in Canada fairly recently to a shift of, we can do all of that we want, but if children aren't engaged, if they're not seeing the relationship of what they're learning to who they are, then we've wasted a lot of energy. And so there's a shift toward really, really tuning in to children, to their curiosity, instead of overriding it with adults' belief about what they should know, right?
Of the way it should be, yeah.
And it's not that teachers don't teach, and it's not that parents aren't there and supporting, but it's an intention for us to step back first and observe and listen very, very carefully to children, and then prompt and encourage and learn alongside each other.
Right. Now, kind viewers, you might either be catching this live, in which case you're very welcome to pop a question in the chat and I'll try to field it to Susan live, or you may be catching this on replay, in which case also pop a question or comment in, because both I and Susan will actually spot those later and we can respond to you. So just, be active when you watch this stuff. Susan, how did this become a topic that actually engaged you? I mean, why is this something you care about? Where did it all come from?
My childhood?
No. I was thinking the concern about resilience in children and how to use storytelling as a mechanism to help that. Where did that flow out of for you?
Well, it did begin with understanding the power of story through my experiences as a child, from being read to. And those being powerful memories and influencing what I cared about, what I thought about, whether my relationships with other people, and in my work, in working with children as an early learning educator, in a whole variety of roles, I could see that if I was to say a story, if I was to tell a story, if I was to sing a story, if I was to engage children in story in some way, they stopped. They became engaged. It was a way for them to relate, and they enjoyed it. And I really have come to understand in my own life that story not only engages, but it engages my my thinking, but also my heart. And I think both of those things have to be together.
So actually story, I think if I'm sort of reading between the lines here a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm almost hearing that, story becomes a kind of heart-to-heart connector between, one generation and another, right?
It does, yes.
Yeah. How does it function that way? What do you think is going on?
I think we cannot, I think meaningful learning happens when we are in relationship. And meaningful relationship engages us with the heart. I could go off on a tangent, and I don't know whether I should.
Feel free.
All right.
Oh, absolutely.
I'll give an example of what I mean of how we learn in relationship from infancy on. So there's been quite a bit of studies by a fellow named Tony DeCasper, and he sort of opened up the field for those who are looking at how do children learn about language, how do they learn, and when does that happen? And he did studies with moms who are pregnant And what he did in a whole variety of different studies was that when the baby was born, first of all, he would hook them up to soothers that, and babies would suck at an intensity or a speed in which they could choose the sound that they would hear. So it was sort of a channel changer for an audio recording, for audio recordings.
Right.
And the audio recordings at first were either mom's voice or somebody else's voice. And those newborn babies always chose mom's voice. They were tuned in to that mom.
Right.
He went on to do other kinds of studies in which even I don't know whether Cat in the Hat is a familiar story around the world. It certainly is in North America. It's a Dr. Seuss one. There's lots of time and rhythm in it. During the last trimester of the mom's pregnancy, they were asked to read The Cat in the Hat, this story, every day for the last 6 weeks of the pregnancy. And then with 2 to 3 days after the baby was born, they were hooked up to this. And they were, they could choose between the sound of someone else, not their mom's voice, but somebody else reading Cat in the Hat or something else. And those babies chose Cat in the Hat to suck at a rate that would always bring them back to that rhythmical kind of familiar pattern. And the thinking there from that study was that babies are learning, as soon as their ear canals are developed, they're learning about patterns, they're learning about rhythms, they're setting themselves up to be oral language learners. But the other thing about that is that they are learning in relationship to their mother, to hearing their heartbeat, hearing the sounds of their what is their world at that time is in relationship.
That's really interesting. And so perhaps rhythm is being built, an awareness, a consciousness of rhythm is there from the very start, right? I mean, if you think about it's when one thinks about a great story, there's all the stuff to do with dramatic arc and characters and, plot development and all that kind of stuff, right? But really also that most great stories also do have a rhythm, right? That there's things are dum-de-dum-de-dum. It's or the iambic pentameter, if we want to step into Shakespeare or what have you. But there is there's an underlying rhythm, right? Inside written stories, certainly inside film. In the film world, we talk about beats inside a film, right? So obviously in poetry, it's clear where rhythm is. That's very interesting, actually. I never knew about that connection. Right now, we've had a question or a comment, I think, come in from Rob. Hi, Susan. I'm a firm believer in the positive power of failure, but feel in education today failure is actively discouraged and seen as a big negative. My feeling is failure is essential for children to learn and, more importantly, reach their full potential. We'd be very interested to get your thoughts on this.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. We need to be with our children in ways that ensure that they're not at a high risk for, harm. But we do need to offer them opportunities to try things, to test things out, to theorize. They are thinking so deeply from infancy on about all kinds of things, and they need to test it out. And make mistakes and then try again and know that we're there to support them in that. Yeah, I totally agree 100%.
Yeah, right.
With that comment.
When we were talking about this sense of, actually, because we're talking here really about risk of failure, right? Or understanding what experimentation is, understanding where failure is, learning from failure and everything else. And just from our earlier conversation, I recall that my mum, when I was very young, she used to come up with these stories of a magical bed, right? And the deal was that basically the bed had wonderful drawers underneath the bed that has special functions, and things would happen and objects would be deployed, and and this bed could go wherever I wanted it to go. And so I could choose as the child where the journey would go. Now, of course, when you set a story up like that, then of course you're, as the adult, as my mum, was completely winging it, right? I mean, it was, clearly a lot of invention and curiosity had to happen on the fly. And I think I was probably aware of that, even as a child. I think I probably shared that with her. Does that make sense? And so even in the telling of a story, there was maybe an awareness that, that this was an adventure, because it was an adventure whose outcome absolutely wasn't known.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I think when we touch the subject of your course, and we get into this area, I think Rob's spot on. Actually, I think that actually a preparedness to be vulnerable,
Absolutely,
is necessary. Yeah.
I know this research is a little bit old, but less than 10 years ago, there's lots of studying about how much of our conversation in childcare programs is directive, is telling children what they needed to do. Wash your hands, get your shoes on, time for whatever. 80% of a daily chat on average in childcare programs was directive. It didn't invite what your mom invited with you to imagine, to come up with ideas, to think about things. And so being able to think without being told what to think is powerful stuff.
Yeah. We've had a comment come in here from Colleen, who says, thank you so much for your work, Susan. So inspired. I homeschooled my son for a couple of years. I wish I could do it again now. And actually, I suspect that Colleen's looking back on that and thinking, well, there are a couple of things I'd like to have changed, right? But is this idea of being more conscious and aware of stories and using this consciously really to grow children's resilience? Yeah, is this something that's comparatively new, do you think, or is it something that has developed over a period of time? I mean, do you know what I mean? I assume that this is a discussion amongst people who think about these things, and is there a kind of culture, a growing culture of awareness, I suppose, of resilience and the importance of it and so forth, or is this really quite fresh?
I think the idea of children being resilient is, at least in my area, I think the idea of the necessary of creating opportunities for children to grow in resilience is becoming more and more and more valued, because I think we see mental health, emotional health, things happening at a younger and younger age. And so we go, something's not right. We're not doing something well. So I think stories have always been, storytellers will tell you that that's part of what they know to change and help people think and feel and care. The other part, I think, of resilience is caring not just about self, but about others.
Now, something over, I mean, certainly now, and perhaps over a period of time also, unfortunately, people may be catching this video, they may be catching this conversation and still be faced with COVID and still be faced with, the consequences of COVID. And clearly that presents a major challenge for everyone, but also for children, right? Because things are not, people talk about the new normal, but things are basically not normal. They're not going out and meeting their friends, or if they open the schools up, God knows how they're going to handle the social distancing in a school. I can't even begin to think. But parents who are watching this, or educators who perhaps catching this or watching this, might be thinking to themselves, well, how can we start to, what would be the way we would start to put in a program of helping children with this? And I'm sure resilience, and perhaps another topic in your course is to do with leadership, right? I'm sure that perhaps there are some things here that we could at least start to think about or develop or implement. What would be your feeling? How as a parent would one start? What would be the first thing to do?
So one thing, I think there are a lot of educators and a lot of parents who go, oh, I could read to my child, and so they use that as a tool. I guess what seems to make a lot of sense to me is that when we're sharing stories through the use of books, that we don't have a sense of accomplishment if we've made it all the way through, read every single word, and got to the end, and the child hasn't taken off, and we go, yes, got it. that to me, we could instead give the book to our child, let them be in control of the book. If they've stopped and they're paying attention to the pictures, then stop with them and go, oh, wow, what are you seeing here? What are you thinking? And spend time just talking about what it is that's captured them and what's important to them. Using books in that way as sort of a launching pad for conversations that might even be like the one you had with your mom with the drawers. Sort of, where is this going? What could it look like?
Right.
Or it could be what are they afraid of, or what struggles are they having? There's a story about Einstein that's been told, that there was a contemporary of Einstein who recognized how smart Einstein was, and so she asked him, what do I do to make my son smarter? And he sort of paused and sort of thought, and he goes, read him fairy stories. He called them fairy stories. And she kind of thought he was being a bit facetious and sort of said, well, okay, so I read him fairy stories. Then what? Then what do I do? And he said, read more fairy stories. And I think the point of that is that fairy tales put children in a place that the context around the stories are things that really are outside of our world, like Rapunzel being up in the top of a high tower and she can't get down, or Big Bad Wolf coming along and blowing people's houses down. Like they're problems, right? They're difficult problems that causes children to see, oh, there are solutions to problems that I wouldn't necessarily know, or I could think about. But the other thing about fairy tales is that it deals with really tough fears.
Yeah.
The fear of abandonment, the fear of death, of life and death, of all kinds of things that allows, even though we go, oh, that's too scary for our child, it does put those emotions which we all have within us somewhere, that those worries of something happening for me, for my parents, for something happening in this time of a pandemic, right? The fear of losing someone or something that I care about, they're there. And so by using story like fairy tales or like something else, we put it in a place where you can talk about the emotion of it, but it's outside of their current experience. So it gives them a chance to talk about it in a safe way.
Yeah, and also it just gives them a break from perhaps being surrounded by the news, the TV, the newspaper, the adult conversation in the room, and all of that stuff. Right, just takes them somewhere else for a while. This puts me in mind of, I've been reading J.R. Tolkien's biography. A wonderful biography about his entire life, but how did The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings come about, right? And as you probably know, it came out of language, and his love of language and his invention of language, his inventing a whole elfish language and a whole elfish history, right? Prior to actually writing. But the Hobbit was developed as a series of stories that he was working on with his children. I mean, it came out of the dialogue and the work, and the sharing with the children, and the book evolved that way. And Tolkien would not publish these books, and he wouldn't get. I mean, he had tremendous difficulty with finally birthing the books and finally getting them out there, and constant negotiations with the publishers, and he never met deadlines, and he kind of had almost a kind of a pathological resistance to actually putting these books to bed, right? But his then adult children, who had become adults by this stage, guided him tremendously in actually helping him to birth these books, right? And the rest is history. I mean, it became some of the most popular books in the history of fantasy and fiction. But it strikes me that the themes that Tolkien touches on in these books are actually very serious themes. And they weren't to do with Nazism or the World War II or anything like that, but they were very much to do with fellowship, to do with loss, to do with sacrifice, to do with what goes on in real adult experience, but transposed into a world where it's a story. It's at the end of the day, it's a fantasy. It's dragons and things like this. Yeah, I think I'm put in mind of this when hearing you talk about about the role of story.
I in calling this story power, growing resilient children, the focus, of course, is the power of story in children's lives and how they see themselves. But the power of story is also throughout the course, there are stories to help us reimagine ourselves and to rethink ourselves. So it's not just for children, it's for all of us.
Right. Yeah. And one of the topics you touch on in the course is leadership. Yeah. Now, this might almost sound counterintuitive to some people, because they might think, well, kids leaders, aren't they a bit young for that? How does that function?
Leadership, to me, grows out of a place where children know that their voice matters, that they are able to think and see possibilities, and they can speak up and will be taken seriously. And so we see Greta Thunberg, who's found her voice and is making a big difference in the environmental our view of what we can do and what the emergency with the climate is.
Right.
With her voice. But I've also watched really, really young children who ground me, because they're too young to be swayed by what other people might think. They are just tuned in. So for example, I watched probably an 18-month-old exploring sand in a sandbox. And the word that came to mind for that experience of watching how this young child was exploring sand was tenderness. She touched and played with and moved that sand with such reverence. And I thought, okay, how long has it been since I have been that reverent with the earth, with the world that's around me? So I guess I see leadership as something that if I tune in to children and appreciate not just children, but everybody, if I see their leadership from infancy on, then I have also affirmed their strength of voice, so that they can use their voice more and more as they become old enough to be able to do so.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Actually, I think I have to tell a couple of stories actually, which just came to
Right.
mind. So therefore, I think I have to share them. One is Alex was on a suburban train with me in London, right? So around in some, kind of one of London's endless suburbs, and he was 12 at the time, and so we're sitting on the train, and there's a kind of young woman across, right? And and Alex is kind of smiling at her, and so she says, "Well, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And she was clearly expecting the rote answer, kind of train driver, astronaut or whatever. And Alex quite literally said, "I promise, I swear to God, I did not prime him in this answer." Alex quite literally said, "I want to invent a way of solidifying carbon dioxide, eject it into the atmosphere, and solve global warming." 12, yeah, and her jaw just dropped, and mine did too, because I didn't expect anything like that kind of answer out of him, and it kind of made me aware, I guess, of the kind of the what's really going on, inside young minds. It's there's a world there that, and so the question, it seems to me, is the preparedness and the ability to share that world, and I think if stories can unlock even a bit of that door, and a bit of that connection, I think it's a beautiful thing. But I mean, another, when you're talking about the child with the sand, a number of years ago, and this is in no way political, and this is not about politics or anything like that. But I was in Gaza, and so I had various meetings and so forth, and my job at the time was a kind of investigative filmmaker and chap, so I was going around all sorts of unusual places, and and Gaza, of course, is surrounded by broken buildings and kind of posters of fighters, and I mean, war is just all around. But one of my kind of strongest memories was stopping for a moment and seeing a young girl who must have been 4 or 5 years old, and what she was doing was playing sandcastles, but with mud in the street. And she was literally building a small structure, moving the mud from one place to another and simply playing with the mud. And it was kind of, in one scene, it was sort of, the next generation trying to build something, trying to engage with something, playing, trying to step out of this other reality that is just, is just there all of the time. So I just feel moved to share that. But I think it's isn't it the kind of the associative power of story that enables these things to happen?
Yes. As you were talking, I was thinking, I brought with me a couple of quotes from children, because and it sort of flows on from what you were talking about in my mind anyway. I found some of the words of children to be profound. There's metaphor. They see things in relationship with one another, and there's metaphor. So one child who 4 years old was Simone. To take a step forward, you need to lose your balance. And then other children who were exploring, sort of children that were 2.5 to 5 years of age, they were exploring what trees are, what they understood about trees. And there's all kinds of ideas and theories about how those trees breathed or how they could function. And one child said, the voice of the trees is beauty. And then others were talking about the strength of the trees isn't like ours, like in our muscles. Their strength is in the courage of their hearts. And then they were also thinking about life and death. And so they talked about life and death. They stay together every day. The depth of children's thinking is profound.
Yeah, right. We should listen much more carefully, right?
Yeah.
Actually, I often think that true storytellers are actually story listeners. I think that I think that the word story listening should be up there with storytelling, and yet somehow we locked on to storytelling Do you know what I mean?
I
And
do.
a lot of focus on that, but actually story listening is is a big part of our job, I think, isn't it?
I think that's the emphasis in this course.
Of
To
course, right?
help us.
Which is actually the perfect moment to actually show people the course, and in a shameless plug for people to buy the course and enroll in the course and everything else. Let's see if I can cue it up onto the screen. Ooh, that's clever, Paul. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So look, folks, the course is called Story Power: Growing Resilient Children, and you can find it on Udemy. That's udemy.com. And really, it's not expensive at all. It's at the moment it's $10, £10, something like that. So basically, well, Susan, why don't you talk us? I'm going to try to scroll down the screen a bit, and you can sort of talk us through a little bit what's in the course. Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, I can't see it very well.
Just for a couple of minutes. So in fact, I'll take it down to the curriculum. So here we go. We've got stories and belief, curiosity, understanding, empathy and resilience, listening and perspective, and leadership. So which of these I'll put you on the spot here. Which of these do you think is really the most significant module in the course?
There's a progression in sort of thinking, but I would curiosity. I think the ability for us to be curious, genuinely, authentically curious about our children, is absolutely key to growing their creativity, their problem-solving skills, their thinking skills, and their empathy.
And how does the course work? I mean, what's the way in which the course functions, and why did you design it the way you did?
So each lecture or whatever section of it starts basically with framing it through story, and then we do some thinking about that. There's probably also a few more stories that are woven through there, and those stories are not necessarily some of them are a personal or reflection. Some of them are studies. There's stories that are different kinds of stories. And then at the end of each section, I do ask those who are working through it to stop and to do something or to think about something. And some of those are musical. There's audio files that, as well as things to read, as well as just things to stop and just think for a minute before you move on.
Yeah, actually, I would say one of the beautiful things about this course is the workbook you've constructed and the exercises you've put in here. So I think it's clearly not just a passive course, is it? I mean, you are inviting people to be, to be active, right, and to interact with the material.
Yes, it's a bit of a challenge for me to figure out how to encourage interaction, because like most of us, I mean, we just do better, right? If we have a chance to sort of have some back and forth. So the invitation is for you to use the workbook as a guide to thinking or reflecting, but maybe share that with somebody in your household or a colleague, or put something in the Q&A section of Udemy.
Actually, would parts of the course be possible to share with your children, or if you're an educator with children in the class? I mean, could you actually open it up that way? Would that be doable? Would there be a part of it where you could almost discuss the agenda, or would that be too much?
I don't know whether I mean, because it's
if you got into curiosity, for example, and you could sort of say, well, look, and we're looking at this, and there's this moment, or there's this idea. What do you think? Is there a way that it could be used that way as well?
I guess it depends on what age of your child that you're with, but yes, I think we're in this. We're in this together. we're in a place where we need to not be separate from that. I mean, that's the other thing I wanted with this course. Was sometimes we have professional development for educators, and we have parenting courses, and I wanted there to be conversation together, and children are at the center of that. So having conversations that that invite everybody to be thinking about the same things and getting their feedback and their ideas makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Now I've got to ask you, because this was your very first online course, right?
Yeah.
What was the experience like of making the course?
Oh my. So I struggled because it felt like everything was new. How do I put everything together, and how do I use technology, and how do I edit? How do I film? How do I film myself? And so I found it almost overwhelming, and I know I wouldn't have created this course without Paul, without Brilliantio.
Thank you. Yeah.
And what I have found in working with you, Paul, is that you offer opportunities to sort of try this, because my experience says that you can waste a lot of time on this program or that program, but you could use this, or this technique works for me, or so you've given me an opportunity to start, not from the very beginning, but partway through, and then pushed me out of my comfort zone, like now, but stayed by my side to say, yeah, you can do this.
It'll be okay.
It'll be fine. It'll be great.
Yeah.
And as a parent or as an educator, that's what I would want with my children, right? So what you've done is you've modeled with me the way I want to be with others. And I have tremendously appreciated Brilliantio and your work.
Well, it's wonderful to have seen it, because I still recall our first conversation. It must have been, gosh, 6 or 7 months ago, something like that. And I remember the first tentative steps of, well, perhaps I'd like to teach this, and perhaps this could work, and and here we are. The course is live. People are coming into the course is being reviewed, and and here you're on a live stream, and I've got a sense that this is just the very, very beginning, actually, of what you'll be doing in this area. And the message you're bringing, the wisdom you're bringing, the experience you're bringing, the community you're starting to create around this topic. And actually, I think I'm going to go out on the limb here and say this is probably one of the most important courses that I think Brilliantio will ever help to have fostered, because there is no more important thing than the future. There is no more important thing than actually, empowering children to believe in their curiosity, to believe in their imagination, to believe in their capacity, to believe in their leadership, to trust themselves. And I think it's a very beautiful thing you've constructed here. I've shot archery all of my life, and I had a long gap, and I came back to it, and I had the great privilege to encounter someone who coaches archers for the Olympics, and he spotted me shooting, and he wanted to take me on for a while, and the biggest single thing I learned from this person, and obviously archery is, it's a sport, but it's very much a mental thing as well. One of the biggest things I learned was simply trust yourself. Trust yourself. You can do this. You've got this. Trust yourself. And I think it's a beautiful thing that you've constructed here to give, parents, to give parents, to give educators, tools that they can use in the fostering of that relationship with children. So, I must say thank you, actually, honestly, for what you created. Yeah. Well, look, everyone, that's the end of today's show. I can only encourage you, if you can, and if you're interested in this, to enroll in the course. Go and check it out, and basically put it into action is what I would say. Yeah. And if you have any comments or questions, as I say, if you're catching this on replay, feel free to put them in the comments, and I know Susan and I will actually spot them. Yeah. Susan, thank you very much again. Yeah, it's been a privilege. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.